Have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8361, offered by Mr. Massie of Kentucky. Page 6, beginning on line 2, strike, quote, "the Attorney General," unquote, and all that follows through line 16, and insert, quote, "within 24 hours after the Attorney General receives a request from an individual to remove the name of the individual from the database, the Attorney General shall comply with the request." Quote.
All that follows to line 16. That's what he's striking. The gentleman has 5 minutes to explain.
I think the chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I think the chairman. This amendment is very simple, and it addresses a concern that has been surfaced already today. I think Mr. Jordan addressed the concern. That is, if somebody's name is put on this database, let's say they're in an abusive relationship and they're convinced or coerced to do that, and they're able to separate from that relationship, the other person, the antagonist, knows that the person may not be able to get the right to have a gun for 21 days. Now, page 6 here, in the original language of the bill, describes an expedited removal process which shall not take effect later than 24 hours after the time at which a removal request is submitted. I think that's a good provision. The problem is it leaves far too much discretion to the Attorney General to come up with the process for allowing this person who wants to reestablish their right to keep and bear arms to do so. It's the text of the underlying language of the bill, the chairman's amendment in the nature of substitute, says the Attorney General shall consider input from stakeholders in development of the expedited removal process. I have a question before I proceed, and I'll yield to somebody on the other side of the aisle if they'll answer. Who are the stakeholders that the Attorney General shall consider input from, and why wouldn't we be the ones who prescribe that process instead of a vague reference to the Attorney General coming up with some rules and a vague reference to stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders? That would be my question if somebody on the other side of the aisle would. And that's on page 6, line 15. And I'll give you time, and I don't want to waste any time here.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield to Chairman.
I must say the language of the bill as currently gives two alternatives. Mm-hmm. But since it says the Attorney General will establish procedures by which an individual may remove his or her name from the database, which shall include the following: removal upon request made to the Attorney General by the applicable individual, which shall take effect on the day, Section 2, I should say, subsection 2. An expedited removal process which will take effect not later than 24 hours. The individual has that choice already. In other words, if the individual wants his name removed in 24 hours, he has that option now. He doesn't, your amendment is simply unnecessary. He can do it now.
Reclaiming my time, the petitioner is only guaranteed that 21 days, that their concern will be addressed within 21 days. That's all the law absolutely requires. This law, the underlying bill that I seek to amend, has a reference to a 24-hour time period, but it doesn't have enough meat on the bones there, and there's no guarantee that somebody could get their firearm, their rights back in that 24-hour period. So let me describe, running out of time, and I would still yield when I'm done with this to anybody who'll tell me who the stakeholders are on page 6, line 15. But my amendment is simple. It just simplifies your language, and it says, instead of having this 21-day period and this vague 24-hour period, let's just have the 24-hour period, because the 21-day period is redundant, and let's make the 24-hour period a guarantee. And that's what my amendment does. I'll yield to Mr.
Would the gentleman
Bishop.
yield?
Let me yield to Mr.
Maybe I can compound the question and refer both to you if we've got sufficient time remaining. If the 24-hour period is always to be respected, notwithstanding this phrase about a procedure that ensures to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others, if that's always going to be observed and they're going to comply within 24 hours, what is the office, what is the purpose, what is the function of the 21-day period? And then I yield back to Mr. Massie to further yield.
I'll yield to anybody who would tell me who the stakeholders are on page 6, line 15.
Well, the intent of that, you yield to me? Okay.
Yes.
The intent of
Ms.
that
Jayapal.
is really to speak to people who are professionals in suicide prevention and to make sure that individuals are not in that crisis mode when they're requesting the removal. But it does already allow for an expedited removal process of 24 hours.
So I urge adoption of my amendment. It would just take out this vagueness. I'm not, if we wanted mental health professionals, we should say that, not stakeholders.
Time of the
My time's
time of the
expired.
gentleman has expired.
I'll yield back.
I recognize myself in opposition. Does the gentleman withdraw his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, and I misstated the effect of the amendment a moment ago. If you read Section 2 in its entirety, an expedited removal process which will take effect not later than 24 hours after the time in which removal request is submitted that ensures to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others. The Attorney General shall consider input from stakeholders in the development of this process. In other words, the Attorney General has to decide that a 24-hour removal does not pose a risk, and either agree with that or disagree with that. I think that's a good safeguard.
Chairman, yield for a question.
No, one second. I think that's a good safeguard to have in the bill. And yes, I will yield for a question.
So I made an analogy earlier about thinking other situations where the federal government might request or receive a waiver of a constitutional right. I talked about Miranda. So the rights of the criminally accused, they have to be warned, and if they choose to speak, they can. But one of the other things I remember about that, I believe to be true, is that if they begin speaking, and at some point in time they decide to reassert their rights and stop speaking, it has to be respected immediately. So if someone has a constitutional right to purchase a weapon, and they put themselves on this list, how can the federal government delay immediately complying with their request for
Reclaiming my
removal?
time, someone puts their name on this list because they regard themselves as a danger to themselves. They've surrendered whatever constitutional right they have to immediate restoration. They have submitted themselves to the provision of this bill.
I don't think that, I mean, we'll have to see what the case law holds at the time, but I can't
There
imagine
isn't any
that-
case law yet.
I know, that's what I'm saying, but it's hard for me to see how that complies with, I mean, once they
Mr.
change
Bishop, will
their
you
mind.
yield to, Mr. Bishop?
Wait a minute, it's my time.
It's your time, I'm sorry.
I'll yield to the gentleman. No, I'm
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say, you are aware, of course, Mr. Bishop, you have the right to anytime you choose to voluntarily waive any of our constitutional rights. And when you participate in this program, it's a voluntary program. No one's compelled to participate in it. And so they can end their voluntary participation, but it's a voluntary program that they're allowed to participate in and not compelled to.
and reclaiming my time, given that fact, when they can
I mean,
surrender
the
their
speedy
right
trial is an example,
for-
Mr. Chairman, where someone is guaranteed the right to a speedy trial, but they can waive their right to it, and it happens
Yes.
all the time.
And as here, they can waive their right to possess a gun, and they can waive it knowing that to get it back, they may have to wait 24 days.
Chairman, yield for further on that point?
Yes.
So I don't disagree. In fact, that was the point that I made about the Miranda situation. Someone can waive their right, but the waiver stops whenever they reassert the right. In fact, I never did
Reclaiming my
speedy
time,
trial, but
the waiver stops, the person knowingly agrees that the waiver may last for as much as 24 days after he waives it, because that's the statute that he's waiving his right under.
Would the gentleman yield?
Who's asking that?
Congressman.
Yes, I'll yield.
So what does the 24-hour period that's in here hope to do? Why is it in here? Because all I seek to do is make it more clear and make that the default. Instead of 21 days, make the default 24 hours.
It can be 24 hours, subject to
Why would we
what
want 24
we were discussing
hours?
a moment ago.
Why would 24 hours be necessary instead of 21 days? Because the next question
It
I
may
would
very
ask,
well be necessary if the person continues to pose a danger to himself, and that's for determination.
Or here's a hypothetical that maybe you forgot.
I'll yield to the gentlelady.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe you forgot that you were on this list, and you are not in danger of the mental health challenges that perhaps you were under when you signed up for the list, and you decide you now want to exercise your Second Amendment rights. You go to buy a gun. You find out you suddenly are reminded that you're on the list. And so you say, oh my goodness, I'm fine. I voluntarily take myself off, and you go and you make that request, and that would be one circumstance in which I could see that being necessary.
I'll yield back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Bucky is recognized.
I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I am a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I proudly have co-sponsored this legislation because I believe in the effort to do everything we can to minimize suicides and to protect people from themselves under certain circumstances. I have issues with this bill, and I want to state them on the record here, and I will, at the conclusion, ask the gentlelady from Washington if there is a way of trying to work on this bill before the end of this markup or in some time after this markup to address the concerns that I have. The first concern is a fairly minor concern, and it is on page 2, at the bottom of page 2, line 23, where it says, by providing necessary documentation of the identity of the individual, including government-issued photo identification in person. It doesn't say where in person is, and I'm assuming that the Attorney General's regulations would define where in person is. My next concern is on page 6, and it is the concern that I think Mr. Massey's trying to get at with this amendment in part, and that is, first of all, if you look at the subparagraph 2 of subparagraph E, it says 24 hours. I really beg anybody on this committee to tell me when the federal government has done anything in 24 hours. So I think it's a little absurd, but I do think that 21 days is reasonable. The problem I have with 21 days is when Senator Schumer was a congressman, he went into the gun laws, and there is a provision in the gun laws that allows the ATF to restore the rights, Second Amendment rights, to a nonviolent felon. So someone commits tax fraud, they're not likely to commit any kind of gun crime. The ATF makes that determination. What Congressman Schumer at the time did was to say the ATF may not use any funds to process applications for this program. Now, Senator Schumer has continued to put that rider in appropriations bills for the Department of Justice. That could be done here also. It could be very easily be inserted in the appropriations bill to say the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, may not review the applications to be taken off this list. It would have to pass Congress. It would be a concern, but it is something that I can see, and I think it's a door that may be open. I would suggest that on page 6, E, subparagraph 1, instead of received, it should be 21 days after the application is submitted. And I say that because the idea that somebody at the Department of Justice is going to receive something and date stamp that and the time starts running, I think is much more ambiguous than when somebody actually submits the document and knows that in 21 days they are off that list and can purchase a firearm. The third issue that I have is the issue that Mr. Massie raised earlier. I agree with Mr. Massie on the reading of 922, and Mr. Bishop on the reading of 922D, 18 United States Code, Section 922D, and that it opens the door for the Department of Justice to prosecute somebody who, a federal firearms licensee or anybody else who sells or gives a weapon to a family member or someone. And then I think the same issue applies to page 8, line 3 with the Brady Act. I think there is also an open door there for a violation that occurs. And so I have concerns with the bill. I also have concerns with what is happening in this country with suicide. I think Mr. Gomert listed a number of the reasons why we have suicides and why we should be dealing with underlying causes of suicide. But I am concerned in several regards about this bill and in whether it is tight enough to really deal with this issue at this point. So I apologize to my friend from Washington for misleading her when I initially sponsored this bill, co-sponsored this bill. But I still would like to try to work on this bill, make it stronger, and bring it back. Since we have 6 days left in this, legislative days left in this Congress, perhaps next Congress, and see if we can't do something to reduce the number of suicides in this country. And with that, I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
Thank you. I just want to thank the gentleman for his excellent partnership and work on this and for co-sponsoring the legislation. I don't have a problem with any of the changes that you suggested. I have always been and said to Mr. Massie earlier that I was willing to consider language that would address the issue on page 7. The other things that you mentioned, Mr. Buck, are fine. Both those changes that you suggested are fine. I think the change about the application being the date on which the application is submitted instead of received makes sense to me. And I think in terms of page 7, the question on page 8 had not come up before, but on page 7, I said that I was willing to address that before we go to the floor because my intent was very clear, and I was very happy to address that. So I appreciate your partnership, and I appreciate you're actually reading it thoroughly and wanting to address this issue and suggesting changes that I think are very acceptable.
I wish I'd read it thoroughly earlier.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? For our purposes, hasn't Mr. Fitzgerald already been recognized on this? Not on this. No, okay. Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I don't even know that I'll take all my time. It just seems to me, originally when I saw the bill and now seeing Mr. Massey's amendment, that even the author referred to the successes at the state level. It just continues to appear to me that this is absolutely the type of thing that could be better handled by your state legislature. When you think of the diagnosis of somebody that has serious mental health issues, so significant that they would actually go to the list of professionals that you have, and that varies from state to state as well, right? You could be talking about a school psychiatrist. You could be talking about a middle school or a high school counselor where somebody goes in there and admits this. And then beyond that, clinical social workers and psychologists, all licensed by the states. And then we kind of come in here with the federal footprint and say, okay, this is how we're going to fix all of this. So my problem now is, and I think this is what Mr. Massey's amendment does, it once again kind of demonstrates that this could move very quickly to be put in place where somebody could find themselves on this federal list, but then to unwind it later on and go back through this system, and including an attorney general, I think there would be a hesitancy by each and every one of these individuals that may originally have been counseled to say, time out. We just had somebody that admitted they are suicidal and have some serious mental problems, and what you're telling me is you want me to declare this person fine. I don't see it. I don't see that happening anytime quick, especially with the list of individuals that are right in the statute. So, I'm not saying that, it isn't a laudable goal. It probably should be. You yourself, the author said that there were states that were having good successes with this, and maybe that's because they could tailor-make it to their own situation and the mental health care professionals and the systems that evolve organically in each state. We shouldn't come in here with the heavy hand of the federal government and say, we can do this better. It's a mistake. It was said right away, it's a 10th Amendment type of situation by, I think, Congressman Gomer. We should allow this to move from state to state. If, in fact, it's successful, that's what the state legislatures should feed on. So I think that you're forcing something today. Mr. Chairman, you're forcing a vote today, too. I mean, it's not just about the author. The committee has a stake in this. We want to make sure that we continue to move good legislation forward to the Rules Committee, to the floor that makes sense. So this is as much your call, Mr. Chairman, as it is anyone else's. And it just doesn't seem like it's ready for prime time today.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
And I thank the gentleman for speaking on my amendment. I want to speak to a point he made. If somebody went to the effort of getting a doctor's recommendation to put themselves on this list, what is the threshold to get off the list in 24 hours? It seems almost unovercomable. Because the Attorney General, by the way, not some state health person, but the U.S. Attorney General, right, has to ensure to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others. They've gone to great extent to prove that they do, to get on this list. How would they ever reach this threshold to get off the list? And I think there are times when they need to get off the list in less than 21 days. If there's a harm to them, like really that's what should be considered in Section 2 if it's going to be conditional on anything. Does the person themselves have fear of their lives? And it should be a consideration such as that. But I think the threshold is so high that this section, even though it's Section 2, subparagraph 2, it's important, but it's dead on arrival. And so my amendment seeks to make it actually an active section and just say within 24 hours, the individual's name can be removed. And I yield back.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would just say it seems somewhat ham-handed. It's not ready, and I would hope that the committee would not advance it today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purposes Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
So I've actually read this bill multiple times, and there's some problems, I think, in the language of the bill. But I just ask myself a few questions. It seems to me that we are recognizing in here that someone is voluntarily waiving their constitutional right to purchase a firearm. I thought that was kind of agreed, everybody agreed to that. And then to get off the list, they're going to have to provide some demonstration that they've stabilized or their mental condition is stabilized. Well, so we had a little discussion over here. I won't blame anybody else. But it seems to me if you're going on voluntarily, do you have the capacity to go on and waive your rights? If this were under the Miranda, for instance, which Mr. Bishop was talking about, there would be infirmity in whatever right they gave up after having heard Miranda rights because they couldn't construe them. And I guess that's the question I'm struggling with now, having gone through this bill multiple times, is are we imputing onto somebody who actually just provides their name and their identification, under Section 2A1, or if they do the alternative, they've got a letter from a mental health professional saying that doesn't say what they have to say. The point is they get on there, they're waiving the right, but to get off, they're going to have to demonstrate some kind of different mental capacity than to get on. Seems to me like you might have a question as to the validity as the initial waiver, because I'm not sure that they had the cognitive capacity to actually waive. And that would be a problem, which is why, oddly enough, there are federal laws that cover people who don't have the capacity to waive, and they're already in place. And there are state laws that do the same. So this bill seems kind of somewhat infirm and superfluous to me. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?